Hello everybody. Okay, so today we are going to talk about thesis statements, which I'm sure you're sick of because you probably hear it every class where you have writing. You probably heard a lot about thesis statements in College Writing 1 and in College Writing 2, and it's all the same kind of thing. I'm hoping that the kinds of things that I'm going to say about thesis statements are going to be substantially and importantly different than what you've heard before, because they're all related to what I think the real job of that paper that you're writing is, which is not to write something nice, but to write something persuasive on two levels. So let's talk about how the thesis statement puts you in the right frame of mind and gets you started on the right foot. So the first tip, be controversial. So what I often see in student papers are very, very safe thesis statements. That is, ones that you are really confident you're able to prove. You don't stretch, you don't reach further than you can safely grasp. They're just not that exciting. Now, I don't need excitement to read a paper because remember, I'm contractually obligated to read the paper. That's not the point. The point is that if you have a very, very safe thesis that is pretty much guaranteed to be true and everybody knows it's already true and doesn't really need an argument to be persuaded that it's true, is that you're really not stretching yourself, you're not exploring the topic, and it's really just you're giving yourself too easy of a task, so even if you do it well, it's not going to be impressive, right? And one easy test to see how controversial your thesis is to imagine the opposite of your thesis. Imagine how likely it is that your thesis is false. And if you think that if you can think about your thesis and think, I'm going to imagine that it's false and that is just hard to make sense of even, then that's a big signal that your thesis is pretty much guaranteed to be true, and therefore any kind of argument that you give in favor of it is going to be phoning it in, and that it's not going to be impressive as a demonstration of your understanding of the material. Probably what the task that you have set yourself up for is just reporting the positive case for that thesis that you have read somewhere. And reporting is a lot different than arguing. And your reader, your grader, your prof, can easily tell the difference between those two things. So I'm going to give a diving analogy for this. I'm going to use another sport. It's a weird sport. We only ever watch it every 4 years, maybe Summer Olympics. The reason why I'm picking diving is because diving is a judged sport. And of course, grading has judges. But diving is particularly interesting because it's not just about how impressed the judges are. There's another element to the scoring system. So you've all watched diving, I'm sure, even if you don't follow it. I don't follow it. I occasionally watch every 4 years. But here's what I know about diving. I know that diving is super difficult and that the kinds of things that they're able to do, including and especially the entry into the water where they hardly make a splash, is just ridiculous. Those are the parts, the form with which they tumble and roll in the air, and then the entry into the water. Those are the parts that the judges judge for the execution, right? And if that was all that was involved in the competition, was just impressing the judges on the quality of your execution of a dive, then no diver would ever do any of the crazy flips and twists and tumbles that we see them do, because they'd be focused on just a good execution. And it's easiest to do when you're not doing anything complicated, right? So if all that was involved in diving was getting 10s from the judges because your form off the board was great and your entry was like splashless, which we all know that they can do, then nobody would do a difficult dive. They would all just do a basic front dive with no twists or flips, and they would kill it. And every judge would have to give them 10s, and then there'd be no winner. Well, these people aren't silly, right? They know what they're doing. They know that they want to see some difficulty. So how do you promote that difficulty in the sport of diving? You define a grading system that rewards difficulty. Now, the way that they do that in diving is relatively simple. Every dive gets ranked and gets a point value attached to it that's its degree of difficulty. So I don't know the exact points numbers for particular dives, but these are things that are published by international federations of diving and things like that. So everybody, the divers, the judges, the audiences, they know which dives are more difficult than which other dives because of the ranking system, because of the number that the number assigned to that dive as its degree of difficulty. The diver has to declare what kind of dive they're doing beforehand, so the judges kind of can prepare themselves and know what they're looking for, if they're looking for twists and or tumbles, this kind of thing. And so everybody knows what kind of dive the diver's going to do. The diver attempts it. The judges score the execution of the dive, and then, and here's the important part, the judges' scores get multiplied by the degree of difficulty. So what that does for diving is it really incentivizes divers to pick a really difficult dive to do. The most difficult dive that they think they can pull off half decently, not perfectly, but decently. Because they're doing this trade-off, if I play it safe and pick a dive that I know I can kill and get 10s on, that dive's going to be at a particular level of difficulty, and so I'm going to score this particular amount of points. But if I pick a dive that's slightly harder than what I can do perfectly, then my scores are probably going to be less from the judges, but that's going to be more than made up for by the fact that they get multiplied by this higher number on the degree of difficulty, on the increased degree of difficulty on this dive. And so you get this nice balance where divers are always pushing themselves to do something that's right on the edge of their skill level, and they still, for the most part, do them excellently. So you get drama, you get everything else. It's great. It's similar to essay grading in that there isn't this formal system where you have a judge and you have a degree of difficulty, right? They're both contained in the professor, right? The professor, but the important part, and the reason why I think this analogy works, is because professors do have that internal degree of difficulty. They're aware, as they read your paper, about the difficulty of what it is that you're talking about and what it is that you're arguing for. And they also are going to look at how hard the job, the task that you set yourself in the paper is, and they're going to calibrate their expectations and how much they get impressed by how well you back up what you have set out to do based on the difficulty of it, right? So if you pick a really safe thesis, then you really have to kill it. You have to do everything right with that simple thesis, to support that simple thesis, to impress the prof. If you pick something a little bit more difficult, then you have to work a lot less hard. Let me rephrase that. You don't have to work a lot less hard. You have to work equivalently hard, but in this case, you don't have to be perfect, because the grader is going to forgive you some mistakes because they appreciate the difficulty of the task that you set yourself. And if we remember, of course, that the real task of an essay is not to persuade the audience of the thesis, right? But it's to show the prof what you've learned, to persuade the prof of a totally different thing than the thesis, to persuade the prof that you have learned things in the course, right? That you're a thoughtful individual who has integrated and assimilated the concepts that you have read about and taught about in the course. Then a more difficult thesis is going to give you that opportunity to do it, and the prof is not going to be worried as much if it's a little bit rough around the edges. But if you pick yourself something super modest, something easy to prove that doesn't require using a lot of the more subtle things or the more difficult to learn stuff in the course, and it's really safe. Maybe it doesn't even rely on anything you learned in the course, it's just stuff that you could have written before you even took this course. Then it doesn't really matter how well you execute that. The prof is not going to care, right? The prof's not going to be impressed because they're not going to see that you have learned anything in their course. So that's why I think being controversial is so important. You have to set yourself a task that even if you don't do it excellently, is still going to impress the prof, right? Because not only are they going to see that the argument that needs to happen to back up that thesis has to be impressive, so even if it's rough around the edges, they're going to be impressed, but they're also going to be impressed by the fact that you just picked that kind of thesis to defend, because you recognize that gives them a message too, that you recognize that there are wrinkles to things, and that the area of study is complicated and has interest and has difficulty in it, and it's not just these really kind of sweeping, bold statements of stuff. So here are some examples to kind of illustrate that. So, and these are either really close to or identical to theses that I commonly see in undergraduate, freshman, sophomore papers. So I'll see thesis statements like this one right here: racism still exists today. I get it. Unfortunately, there are people who are going to say that that's a controversial thesis. It's not. It's also really kind of sweeping, general, and vague, and it's going to be very difficult to show that this is false, because the opposite of this claim is this: no racism exists anywhere. Right? You got to look everywhere to establish that, and that's a pretty tough claim to prove right here, right? In fact, it sounds ridiculously tough, which illustrates how easy it is to back this up. All you got to do is find one example of racism, and this is true. And how easy is it to find one example of racism? Really easy. Job done on the essay, but you haven't really exerted yourself. You haven't really demonstrated any learning of course material. So even if you do this really well, even if you find a really good example of racism, and even if you write about it nice and stylishly, it's not really going to impress your prof. Especially if your prof spent the whole course talking about different theories of racism, different ways that racism shows up, and you write an essay where you just talk about a really obvious and simple case, straightforward case of racism. They're going to kind of shrug their shoulders and go, what did you learn in my course? I can't see anything that you learned in my course. And so they're going to find it really hard to give you a good grade. Similarly, and this one's kind of more for literary analysis, so if you took college writing 2, then I think this is the kind of thesis that they were looking for, right? So with you, and usually they're compare and contrast, or at least you have the opportunity to write a compare and contrast type essay. Yeah, those can have really bad thesis statements, and I see things like this all the time. And the thesis statement, the argument that people set out to prove in their paper, is something that basically says there are differences and similarities that you can see between two things, between two works of literature, and that has to be true, that there are differences and similarities. This isn't a thesis even, right? It's I'm going to talk about differences and similarities, right? You don't even have to prove it. You just talk about it and it's proved. It's so easy that it's not even worth doing. And your prof knows this. So when your prof sees a thesis like this, there's a silent, subtle rolling of eyes that happens, and they kind of read it, and they're already deathly bored because they've seen hundreds of essays like this, and they know that you're not stretching, because all you're doing, what this tells a grader is, get ready for just a random collection of observations I made about this paper that were the first things that popped into my head. And that does not communicate thoughtfulness. That does not demonstrate that you have paid attention during lectures or understood the readings or anything like that. We need to see something more, all right? So here are some better examples in the same kinds of areas that promise something much better because you're setting yourself up for a more challenging task, but one that you still think that you can do, right? So remember, with the diving analogy, it's not like divers go up and just pick the most technically difficult dive that exists. They pick one that they still think they can probably do. So for the racism, instead of just racism exists today, right? I've refined this so that it's talking about a particular area and making a specific claim that in restaurants, some racism is worse in some places than in other places. Now, I don't know if that's true. In fact, one of the things that that this also incorporates is in a tip that I'm going to tell you about later, which is I would think that only a student who had some experience in restaurants would be able to write something like this, but that's not really increasing the degree of difficulty for the student because you have the background in restaurants. So, but it is increasing the degree of difficulty in the task because now it's much more specific and there's so many more things that could go wrong. It's plausible that this is false. Just switch fast food and fine dining. That sounds, at least to someone who doesn't know much about the restaurant industry, equally plausible. So I've improved this at least 10 times from the other one because now I have something that has just maybe, on first glance, only a 50-50 chance of being true. That's much more controversial. That's much more interesting. Holds the promise for the reader that you're going to have to be a little bit careful now. You're going to have to focus and concentrate on this particular task. You can't just phone it in. Similarly, my lit analysis example here, right, also gets more specific, kind of has to, right, to become more controversial. I'm trying to pick out some aspect of difference. So I'm not just talking about a random catalog of similarities and differences, right? I'm picking one kind of difference, and then I'm talking about a particular way in which it is significance, in which it is significant, or in which it matters. And so this right here has a much better chance of being false, which means I have a much more challenging task to try and support it. And I think I read one of these books, the Jane Eyre and the Weather. I think I read Wuthering Heights like 20 years ago, and it was terrible. And I vaguely remember what it was about. I don't even know if narrative style was one of the things that made it kind of special, and that's why we read it in school. But in any case, like, I'm making stuff up here, but hopefully you can see kind of the general trend. A more controversial thesis that has the possibility of actually being wrong is going to require you in the paper to be more careful and to actually choose your words, your argument more carefully. And your prof is going to know that and recognize it and respect it. And so even if you don't quite pull it off, even if your entry splash is bigger than the next guy's, that's going to be worth more, because if the other guy's nice entry splash was really kind of small, but it was super easy, the dive that they took, right? They're going to be more impressed by your decent attempt by somebody else's perfect attempt, because your attempt was more challenging on the day and not this other person's. Now, you might worry, well, but if I pick something that is controversial, risky, that I might fail to actually sufficiently prove, then the prof might actually not be convinced of my paper. I might fail to support my argument. I might not succeed at defending my thesis. And of course, that would be disaster, wouldn't it? No, it would not. It would be disaster if your task in writing a persuasive essay was to persuade the reader of the thesis statement. But like I said in the video before this, it's not. That's the pretend goal. That's the lie that the profs give you. Hey, pick a thesis, defend it, make a convincing argument that that thesis is true. But that's not really what we care about. What we're looking for is evidence that you know the material, that you have learned something, that it's become incorporated into your knowledge base, right? So even a failed argument can easily do that from a prof's perspective, right? So even if you don't quite succeed, we'll still know that you can dive pretty well. And if you start kind of writing that paper and you realize as you're writing that paper, as you're developing that argument, that you're gonna fall short, well, if you were diving, there's not really much you can do mid-dive if you realize, wait, this dive is too difficult for me, I can't do it, right? You can't pull out, you can't change the dive, you're gonna belly flop, right? And it's gonna be a disaster, and your grade, your score is gonna be terrible, right? But it's different in essay writing. In essay writing, you can wait until almost the last minute and change what you're going to do, because if you're building out that argument and building out that all the things that you're going to use, and then you realize, wait, I don't have enough, I'm actually not convincing myself of my thesis statement, then you can change the thesis statement. You can moderate it, you can back off it a little bit, right? Or you can change it to something else that still lets you talk about all the stuff that you know about, still lets you demonstrate your knowledge, but doesn't make you look silly, right? So you can still succeed even if things go wrong in the argument, just by pulling back on the thesis a little bit in its controversiality, right? So that it still meets that goal. Second tip, be lazy, right? What I'm talking about here, I've mentioned it before in earlier videos, there's nothing wrong with being lazy. Being lazy means being smart, knowing your limits, not working hard for a silly reason, for no good purpose, right? So when translated to thesis statements, being lazy means pick a thesis that lets you use information that you already know, lets you write about what you've already learned in the course, right? So the first thing you should be doing when trying to figure out what thesis statement you're gonna kind of settle on is, well, what do I know? What kinds of things, what kinds of course material can I talk about comfortably with familiarity? And then, well, what thesis statement is going to let me talk about those things? You already do that when you pick essay topics, right? So often you'll get a term paper assignment and it'll have more than one topic, and you're already familiar with strategically picking a topic that's on the stuff that you enjoy the most or study the most or more familiar with, right? This is a little bit more tricky, but you want to do that same kind of thing and try and pick a thesis that lets you talk about the stuff that you know, and only the stuff that you know, and doesn't force you to talk about stuff that you really didn't understand in the course. Now, that's best case. Worst case scenario, though, is that if you pick a topic, and again, I'm going to say a specific topic, like the examples that I've already talked about were specific, then that thesis statement, even if it doesn't limit you to things that you already know, it's going to limit you in another way, which is it's going to limit the amount of new stuff that you're going to have to learn. It's going to limit the research that you have to do, because a nice, clear, and specific thesis statement is going to tell you exactly what research to do. It's going to confine that. It's going to give you a doable task. Instead of being some large kind of thing, if it's specific, it's going to be a manageable amount of research. Okay, I'm going to pick a thesis statement that only talks about this aspect of the problem, so that I only have to go reread and figure out that one paper that talks about this thing. And the reason why you can have a thesis statement like that and use it in this way is because, of course, the thesis statement and the body are related, because the body is the argument that supports the thesis statement. So if we strategically pick a thesis statement that only requires a body of stuff that we already are pretty familiar with, then we're good. And if we pick a thesis statement that we then kind of, as we're developing our argument in the body, we suddenly start to realize, wait, I'm going to have to learn all this stuff and I don't want to learn all that kind of stuff. Then you don't have to write about that stuff. You can change the body to cut that stuff out, but then the challenge is I need to reformulate my thesis so that it only uses the stuff I'm willing to talk about in the body, right? And you can do that fairly late, not 15 minutes before you have to hand it in late, right? But the dynamic, the relationship between the thesis statement and the body, the argument that you use to support the thesis, and the content, the course content, the knowledge content that's in here, right? These two things have a synergy. They're related, they depend on one another. And so if you can develop the ability to kind of pick a thesis statement that only uses stuff that you are comfortable talking about, then that can be a really useful skill in school. Could also be a useful skill for folks like politicians and stuff like that. If you know that there's some truths out there or some good stories to tell over here, then that can help you pick kind of what you want to say or what position you want to take on a particular issue. But that's using all of what I'm telling you for evil, so you don't want to do that. Okay, so, but you do want to write what you know about in two areas, right? You want to write what you know about in terms of course material. That's what the prof is really caring about when they read your paper. But the impressiveness with which you discuss the principles, ideas, and knowledge of the course is going to matter a lot about kind of how well you talk about it, the detail in which you talk about it, any wrinkles or counterexamples that you can bring to the table to use to discuss, or unusual cases, gray areas, right? Edge cases that are difficult to decide. If you can talk about those things, that's super impressive. And the easiest way to do that stuff is to talk about these things, which usually are pretty abstract and broad principles, in specific cases. But if you can talk about specific cases that you're already familiar with, issues or areas outside the course that you already have personal experience in, with, like the restaurant industry, right? So if you, even if you were just waiting tables at a restaurant, you get a good idea what goes on in the back of the house if you pay attention, right? You get a good idea of what restaurant owners and restaurant managers are like, and some of the issues with how to run a restaurant and personnel issues and stuff like that. So that's why I think if somebody knew about, had some experience in the restaurant industry, they could easily draw upon those experiences to talk about, say, racism or conflict resolution or so many other things, right? Ethics, right? Pick something, some body of life experience you already are familiar with, and use that to talk about course issues. That's going to give you something familiar with the kind of unfamiliar stuff to give you some confidence to tackle this. And you'll probably surprise yourself with the kinds of things that you're able to say when you bring this in and start talking about specifics, right? So that's kind of where I am with these two examples. I picked this one right here in part because I knew that this tip was coming, and I was thinking, hey, write about what you know. If you're familiar with this kind of stuff, right, then you're going to be able to say something perceptive, even if you don't think it's particularly perceptive, because it's obvious to anybody who's worked in the restaurant industry. Either your prof hasn't worked in the restaurant industry, so it's going to be very surprisingly perceptive, or they have, and they're going to recognize it and appreciate that you can connect course material to things in the real world, which is going to be very impressive and gratifying for them. So they're going to like the fact that you did that. The same kind of thing here, except for this is kind of premised on the fact that maybe you're a little bit nerdy and you have some background. But if you are an English major, a lit major, and you've taken, say, a previous course talking about literary history and influence, there's no reason why you can't bring that stuff in to inform your paper on this topic, right? So when you get up in your major to your third, fourth, fifth course, it's absolutely okay. In fact, it's great if you can bring in that previous knowledge that you got in those other courses and use it to help tackle the current material in the current course. All right, and the last tip that I have for you is be focused. I've already kind of hinted strongly that a specific thesis is a better thesis. And so I'm going to reiterate that with just a little bit more specificity. I think a specific narrow thesis is better in a lot of ways. It's better for word count in that a specific thesis lets you write more. It's better for that degree of difficulty that I was talking about with the diving analogy, and it's better for organizing your thoughts and research. It's better for being lazy, right? If you have, lots of times I get the impression that students are worried about that they don't have enough to write about. And the typical solution for that anxiety of not having enough to write about is, I'll make my thesis bigger, I'll make my thesis cover more areas. And that's when you get these super broad universal theses like racism still exists, right? Because that then appears to let you talk about literally everything, but because it's so broad and you've kind of phrased it wrongly, it doesn't let you talk about everything, because that thesis only required one example and then you're finished. If you instead pick something super specific, then a super specific thesis like the restaurant one requires a lot of detail, because now you have to be a little bit careful and talk about how racism shows up in the restaurant industry, and maybe recount a couple specific examples of it happening. And examples eat up word count like nobody's business, right? So it's actually the case that the less detailed the thesis is, the less specific the thesis is, the less you can write about it, because you are limited to really broad generalizations and claims that get done in a sentence or two. But if you have a really specific thesis, you have paragraphs and paragraphs of detail that hopefully you're really familiar with and comfortable with saying to fill up the pages. This is why freshmen only are expected to write like 5 or 10 page papers, but by the time you get to senior level, it's 15 or 20 page papers. And then if you're a PhD student, you write a 200 page book. It's not because PhD students write about even broader topics than the ones that freshmen write about. It's because they write about insanely specific and specialized issues or problems. And so they have to spend literally a whole book's worth diving deep to get to the things that they want to talk about and explaining examples really carefully and in detail. So you can borrow from that and start having a more specific thesis. It's going to give you so much more stuff to talk about. It does sound counterintuitive, but it works. I'll give you an example with a compare and contrast essay, right? I already kind of bashed that one and said, look, disappointingly, a lot of compare and contrast essays that I see are just kind of listings of similarities and differences. They're very stale, they're very inert. You're not using this stuff, you're just listing stuff. It's not good. But if your compare and contrast essay was, instead of just a listing, was a judgment about a specific significant similarity or difference and how it impacted the two things that you're comparing, right? That not only is way more interesting, it's going to fill up a lot more space, because now you're going to have to explain the judgment. You're going to have to bring in specific examples that are related to that, not a bunch of disconnected instances of arbitrarily chosen similarities and differences. This has an organization about it. This has a theme to it, and your prof is going to see that and respect it and be impressed by it. More examples. All of baseball is boring, right? But also, no one's going to disagree with that statement. Even baseball fans can't disagree with the top thesis, right? Everybody's going to think it's true. It's not worth arguing about, right? But the ones on the bottom here, they are worth arguing about, right? There's people on both sides of these two issues, on the both sides of these three issues, right? They also communicate some knowledge right off the bat before I've even started defending them, right? People who aren't baseball fans in the audience, if you're not a baseball fan, chances are you don't even understand why these are controversial or what it is that we're even talking about with these, right? So someone who appreciates baseball, someone who's a baseball fan, even can see just from these initial statements, has more confidence that the person writing these has more baseball knowledge than the person who wrote that. And you'll be able to, even if you don't know baseball, you'll get the feeling that these are these already kind of set out a plan. You get some sense of the kinds of things that someone's going to have to say to defend these, and it's a more involved and interesting list of things that you think, yeah, I'm going to have to talk about these things. This right here still leaves the field wide open as to what you're going to talk about. And again, it's so general that either it's an impossible task because it's so big, or it's such a super simple task because like one example is going to suffice. Because it's such a general thing, you're just talking about, if I can just give one example, then that's going to illustrate the whole thing that I'm talking about. More examples. So this one also about racism, because I've seen lots of papers on that lately, right? This is not a bad attempt, because at least this person who wrote this, I think, was in a class where they talked about a specific and special kind of racism, systemic racism. And so this person's trying to use that in their paper as a message to the prof. Hey, I was listening in class. I think I understand the systemic racism stuff. Here's an essay to show you that I learned this stuff, right? So it'd be okay, but still, the justice system is huge, right? And so I'm not liking that thesis statement. I would like something much more like the second one, where you pick something that you know about law enforcement or the justice system and you make a claim there, right? And it's the same general topic. It's going to use the same general issues and facts that are used in that first thesis statement, right? But it allows you to use more familiar details. You don't have to now rely on your shaky understanding of some court case that you just read about. You can talk about, you know, the bicycle laws in your town that you're familiar with because you grew up with them. I'm using that as an example because there's some town in New Jersey that actually requires everybody who rides a bike to get a license from the town that costs like 50 cents. And there's some controversy that the law enforcement in that town uses that to harass youth on bicycles, and uses a probable cause for stops and things like that, right? So it's a controversial thing in general. You could definitely use it to talk about and explore systemic racism, right? And it uses those general conclusions of those course readings, uses the general themes of the course and the kinds of things that you learned about, and asks you to apply them. Now, I have no idea, right, if you could successfully defend the second thesis, but that's not the point. The point is that you're exploring it, right? And if you find out halfway, 3/4 of the way through your thinking about the paper that, you know what, I don't think my town's bicycle laws are a good example of systemic racism, just change the thesis, right? The justice system isn't systemically racist everywhere. My town's really weird bicycle laws that are accused by some as being systemically racist, don't see it. Let me show you how, right? These don't look systemically racist. They lack this thing, they lack that thing that systemically racist laws or systems have, so they can't be systemically racist, right? And by definition, you bring in something unusual like that, and it's going to be neat and new and interesting for your prof. Not that your prof needs interest, because they are contractually obligated to read your paper, right? But it makes your paper stand out. It makes it super evident that you have put in some real thought into the paper, and all of that stuff is very impressive to a prof. So, in summary, those 3 tips: controversial arguments, make better arguments, make better demonstrations of learning. Knowing what you know and only writing about that, only showing your good side, obviously that's true, right? But I just showed you how that works when we're talking about argumentative papers and writing good thesis statements. And then kind of counterintuitively writing about specific thesis statements, giving yourself a specific task, paradoxically, usually requires more words to do, helps you fill up that word count easier, and displays your understanding better when you're talking about specifics rather than generalities. So what's next? Putting these tips to use. You came in with a thesis statement in your before essay. You mapped it, you reverse outlined it, so you extracted your thesis statement. Now I want you to map, but as you map, I want you to take a critical look at your thesis statement and see if it's more similar to the bad ones that I identified in this video or more similar to the good ones. I'm willing to bet that it's more like the bad ones. So if we could explore more challenging, interesting ones, I can help give you specific feedback. It's hard to give you more specific feedback than I gave you in these general tips. But if I see the thesis and the topic that you're going for, I can help you brainstorm thesis statements that actually are impressive and good and interesting, that you're still capable of doing a really good job on.